So, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, and he died on April 4th. So the tradition of the church for saints is to celebrate them on their death day. And so in the book that I read from the Collect for Martin Luther King is actually from April 4th, though the Episcopal Church allows us to move it to January 15th, or in our case, we're moving it to today. So it's interesting, the reason for that is sort of the saint's death day is kind of like their birthday in heaven, is kind of how to think about it. So most of the time, saints' days are the day that they died. So King, preached his final sermon in what was called Mason Temple in Memphis, and it wasn't Mason like the Freemasons. The guy that started, it was a Pentecostal church. The guy that started, the family that started it, was named Mason. And this was the day before he died, and he said these words: "Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few days in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy." Now that's a strange statement to make, he said, because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land, confusion all around. That's a strange statement. And people were going, amen, and all this stuff. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men, in some strange way, are responding. See, he had been imagining himself having a conversation with God about when he might like to live, in what time period. And he imagines himself traveling through history, through time, to Moses and the liberation from Egypt, to Athens with the great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, who taught about freedom, to Martin Luther, his namesake, as he nailed the 99 Theses to the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg, to Abe Lincoln. He called him the vacillating president who finally signs the Emancipation Proclamation, to FDR and the radio address in which he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And he ends by turning to the Almighty and saying, I'd like to live now. He meant his now, the latter half of the 1960s. It was 1968 when he preached those words, April 3rd, like I said. And it was a packed house. People were lining up to get in. And his friend, Ralph Abernathy, had to stall to give King some time to get there. He was still at the hotel. The speech goes on, the sermon goes on, and King saw something darker that night. He spoke in a way of his own death. He said to them, "I have been to the mountaintop, and I have seen the promised land. One day we will get there." He said, "I might not get there with you, but one day we will get there." After the assassination of John F. Kennedy a few years before, King was worried about his life. He would often get death threats, and he relates a story about what has been called the kitchen table revelation. He had just received a threatening phone call that was disturbing, that threatened him and his family. And he pleaded with God that night to give him strength. And he says he felt God's presence. He returned, he says, again and again to that experience to give him strength and hope so that he could go on, so that he could carry his work forward, so he could lead his people to the promised land. I told you before, we are in the season after Epiphany. It's a season of light and darkness. It's a season in which we'll hear stories from the gospel about seeing God, beholding God, and about being seen. If you look through your gospel reading, if you get bored, you can do that while I'm doing this. You can count the number of times that some version of the word see is used. It's a lot. In the Greek, there's different words used for it. Some mean just to kind of observe, and some mean to sort of see deeply. When I was doing what was called the Contemplative Medicine Fellowship a few years back, I've told you about it in the past, one of our guiding teachers told a story. He was told a story about going to the Philippines to work with some people who were delivering care to patients who had HIV and AIDS. There were very few resources, and often the life-saving medicines that were available in other parts of the world were not available there. Now, my teacher did not come with very many resources himself, nor very many medicines either. He wasn't a physician. But what he could do was he could give them his presence. And he would convene a group of nurses and others to talk about their experiences. It was a place for them to share with each other what they were going through, what they were noticing, how they were feeling about it, their triumphs and their tragedies. When my teacher was about to leave and they were thanking him profusely for what he did, he said, I don't know what I've done. I haven't given you anything, but you've given me so much. And they said, we just want to thank you because we feel that we have been seen. We feel we have been heard and seen. Because there's something, very powerful about truly being seen and being seen in a way that means that you are understood in the depths of your being, not judged, not trying to be helped, not being given advice, but simply being seen. Jesus says to Simon, you will be called Cephas, Peter. Who knows what he exactly saw in Peter? But I would say that Peter felt seen. And in that being seen, and when we are seen, we are enlivened. We become called, it almost seems like. Being seen and understood by another answers a deep need in us to not be ignored, to not be forgotten. We begin to feel important, not puffed up, not egotistical, but that we matter. And that is an experience of God. And we can say, behold, God walks among us. I think sometimes we look back on prior periods of history and we think, boy, that may have been a better time. I sometimes think back to the 80s and 90s, when we rode bikes and stuff like that. And I think, didn't we get along a little better back then? Wasn't democracy functioning a little bit better back then? And I think of King's words. He knew that when he said that he wanted to live now, that people would be like, what? Why? But King knew that there was no golden age. And anyway, if there was a golden age, we couldn't go back there anyway. We've got to see God now. We have to experience God now, because there's no other time to do it. We can't go back in the past, and we can't go into the future. But the question is, how? How do we do it? Now we can pray, and we can come to sacred places like the church. And I think that's important. Why is that important? Because prayer quiets us down. The myriad voices from without and within deafen us to God's call. The images that flash over our screen blind us to the image of God in our neighbor. Sacred places like the church also can invoke in us a feeling that there is something else, something more than paved over streets and billboards and cell phones and instant messaging and news. Something deeper underlies our reality. And in the church, we gather with others. When I sit in prayer on Monday nights with a group of folks doing centering prayer, I do feel often some deeper presence, some deeper experience than I do when I'm home alone. When I celebrate here with you, there is something deeper than if I'm doing morning prayer out of the tattered pages of my Book of Common Prayer in the morning. Both are important, and both, I think, necessary. Because it's easy to come to the conclusion that God is not working these days. That God's asleep maybe somewhere. And things are sort of coming apart. And the chaotic gyre of violence is widening, as Yeats said, spinning and spinning. What is happening? We want to scream sometimes, I think. But let's not scream. Instead, let's look. Look at one another, see one another, see past our iPhones and the violence and the hatred. See the goodness in the world and believe in it. See with your heart. And if you can't do that, pray that you can see. Come together with others to pray with your feet and your arms and your voices if you can. There will be suffering. Little do these first disciples know of the extent of that suffering. But God works in that too, and in you. May our lives redeem these times. Amen.